The Iron Dragon's Spine, a tale of blood, sweat, and gold. Imagine a landscape so vast and brutal, it seems crafted by a vengeful god. Now imagine a handful of men, armed only with picks, shovels, and gunpowder, attempting to slice a path through it. They are building a miracle, a single continuous line of iron that will bind a continent together. America calls this the Transcontinental Railroad. The official histories will call it a triumph of American ingenuity. But if you listen closely to the echo in the granite peaks of the Sierra Nevada, you will hear a different story, one whispered in a language they tried to silence, a story of the men who did the impossible, the men whose very existence was erased from the ledger of glory, the Chinese. Their epic began not on the shores of California, but in the heart of the most dangerous mountains on earth, where the gold they sought was not in the earth, but in the paycheck, and their monument was a track laid not in glory, but in blood and ice. Before starting the video, I have a small request for all of you. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe and stay with me to watch more videos like this. And if you are watching from Facebook, make sure to follow my Facebook page. If you enjoy the video, don't forget to like, comment, to share your thoughts, and share it with your friends.
The first 2 years of the Central Pacific Railroad's construction had been a spectacle of arrogance giving way to desperation. The Big Four, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, had believed that ambition and federal land grants alone could tame a mountain range. They were wrong. The Sierra Nevada was not a barrier to be circumvented, it was a fortress to be breached. By late 1865, the railhead was stalled near Cisco, a makeshift camp at a dizzying elevation. Before them loomed granite, a dense crystalline rock that defied every pickaxe. The greatest challenge was the Summit Tunnel, a 1,659-foot nightmare that had to be punched directly through the mountain spine. The few remaining white laborers, mostly Irish, had taken one look at the sheer, icy cliffs and the miserable pay and either quit for the Nevada silver mines or succumbed to disease. The only thing keeping the project alive was the relentless, methodical presence of the Chinese. Ah Sing, the former miner who had become a reluctant overseer and translator, stood at the entrance to Tunnel Number 6, the Summit Tunnel. The air was a biting mixture of snowmelt and the sharp metallic tang of newly blasted rock. He watched a line of men, his countrymen, move with the steady, coordinated grace of a well-oiled machine. There were over 8,000 of them now, comprising nearly 90% of the Central Pacific's workforce. He watched the foreman, James Harvey Strobridge, a man whose face was perpetually set in a scowl of grudging respect and open contempt. Strobridge, initially the most vocal opponent of hiring the Celestials, now relied on them entirely. "Sing, get that muck out of there," Strobridge bellowed, even though Ah Sing was already moving to relay the order to the gang leader. "We need to drill another shaft. The Union Pacific is laying track on level ground, while we're picking at a damn pimple on the face of the earth." The Chinese workers were assigned the tunnel work because the white foremen genuinely believed they were expendable, and paradoxically, because they were the only ones physically disciplined enough for the task. The method was pure agony. The workers, called drills and strikers, worked in pairs deep in the dark, smoky tunnels. A drill held a chisel-tipped steel rod against the granite, twisting it slightly after each strike, while the striker swung a heavy sledgehammer again and again for 10 hours a day. Clang, twist, clang, twist, clang. The only illumination came from sickly tallow candles whose weak light barely penetrated the thick, choking smoke of burnt black powder. Progress was measured not in feet, but in inches, sometimes a mere 8 inches a day in the hardest granite. Ah Sing remembered the day Crocker had brought in the dynamite, not the safe, stabilized dynamite of later years, but nitroglycerin, an oily, temperamental fluid that vibrated with contained violence. "This is the secret weapon," Ah Sing announced, his voice crackling with manic energy. "It'll shatter the granite like glass, but it's unstable. Handle with care. If it freezes, it'll blow if you just look at it wrong." The work was terrifying. The Chinese laborers, accustomed to meticulous care from their mining days, were the only ones who could handle the explosive with the necessary precision. They would carefully pour the unstable liquid into the hand-drilled holes. One accidental bump, one misplaced strike, and the explosion would not just clear rock, it would vaporize the men closest to it. Hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 Chinese workers would eventually pay the price for this acceleration, their bodies instantly incinerated, often leaving no trace to send home across the Pacific.
The winter hell of 1866 to 1867. If the granite was the fortress, the winter was the siege. The first Great Sierra winter struck in late 1866 with a malevolence that defied belief. Snow began to fall in October and did not stop until May. At the summit, drifts reached 40 feet high. The entire world was swallowed by a seamless, blinding white. The Chinese camps, simple wooden shanties and canvas tents, were quickly buried. For months, the men lived in a subterranean world. They dug narrow tunnels through the compacted snow just to reach the cook fires and the tunnel entrances. Ah Sing stood outside tunnel number 7 one morning, trying to locate a supply sled. The only signs of the camp were columns of smoke rising from ventilation shafts dug into the snow. He heard a low, rushing roar like 1,000 angry rivers, the sound of an avalanche. It was a nightmare realized. A massive slab of snow and ice tore down a steep slope, slamming into a section of the track and a small camp of men working on a temporary trestle. When the noise subsided, the air was still, heavy with the silence of obliteration. Strobridge and his foreman knew the drill. They brought out dogs and digging crews. They worked for hours, but the sheer tonnage of the frozen debris was overwhelming. The first bodies they found were frozen solid, still clutching their picks and shovels, killed instantly by the compression. Ah Sing counted 8 men in that single slide, all from the Guangzhou district. It was during this period that the differences in cultural practices became a matter of survival. The Irish workers, who drank the unfiltered river water, were constantly plagued by dysentery and sickness. The Chinese, however, maintained a meticulous focus on hygiene. They bathed regularly in the freezing river, to the scorn of the Americans, and crucially, they drank only boiled water, prepared as tea. This simple act, rooted in ancient tradition, prevented cholera and waterborne illness, keeping their workforce healthier and more productive than any other crew on the line. They were called weak and effeminate, yet they were the ones who endured. The tunnels became their only sanctuary and their final tomb. Inside, the work never stopped. Shoveling snow outside was futile. The moment they cleared a path, the snow would drift back in. The only way to move the earth and rock from the tunnels was to haul it out through a sheer vertical shaft, which was then dumped into boxcars that ran on a short, exposed section of track. "They are literally working and living under snow," a reporter for the Sacramento Union wrote, unable to comprehend the sheer tenacity. The Chinese laborers spent the winter in a suffocating dark, illuminated only by candles and the flash of explosives, constantly inhaling granite dust that would destroy their lungs, all while the world above was silent and frozen.
The Great Strike of 1867, a stand for dignity. By the summer of 1867, the work had reached a fever pitch of danger and fatigue. The men were performing miracles, but the ledger of the Central Pacific still listed them as inferior. The Chinese workers were paid $31 a month, without board. They had to pay their own gang leader and their own cooks. White workers, primarily Irish foremen, were paid $35 a month, plus board and housing. The Chinese were performing the most dangerous work: tunnel blasting, handling nitroglycerin, building the precarious China walls, dry-laid stone retaining walls built on steep slopes. Yet they were paid less for their own starvation. On June 25, 1867, a small group of gang leaders headed by Ah Sing delivered a meticulously written petition to Strobridge at the Tunnel 10 camp. The petition, written in formal Chinese calligraphy, contained 3 demands: a wage increase to $40 per month equal to the white workers, a reduction in the working day from 12 hours in the open and 10 hours in the tunnels to 10 hours a day for all, freedom to quit their jobs, a demand against the strict, near-indentured system they were under. Strobridge, a man who saw the Chinese as tools, not men, exploded with rage. Equal pay? You squatting rice eaters think you're worth the same as a white man? But Ah Sing held his ground. We built this track, Mr. Strobridge. We have sacrificed our bodies in your mountain. We risked the fire in the rock. The white men quit. We stayed. Now you will pay for what we built. The strike was immediate. 3,000 Chinese laborers, the vast majority of the Central Pacific Force, walked off the job. The entire line, a project worth millions in the eyes of the tycoons, ground to a halt. Crocker, who was overseeing the operation directly, was apoplectic. This was not the docile, compliant workforce he had paid to import. This was the largest organized labor action by immigrants in American history to date. Crocker's response was swift and brutal. He cut off all supplies. No food trains, no tea, no rice, and no tools. The workers were isolated in their camps, surrounded by mountains and the silent, immovable machinery of the Central Pacific. If they want to starve, let them, Crocker snarled. I will not negotiate with savages. For 8 days, the gangs held out. But isolation was a weapon far more potent than the mountains. Their food dwindled. The prospect of starvation, a horror they had come to America to escape, began to haunt the camps. On the morning of the 9th day, Ah Sing delivered a single final message to Strobridge. We return to work. It was a forced surrender. The Chinese received no wage increase and no change in working hours. But the strike was not a total failure. It demonstrated a level of organization and collective will that terrified the company leadership and was never forgotten by the men. They had shown that they were not merely coolies. They were a unified labor force capable of shutting down the American dream. A small, unspoken dignity had been won, paid for in hunger.
The final push to the summit. After the strike, the pace became frenetic. The engineers, realizing the tunnels were progressing too slowly, used a revolutionary and incredibly dangerous technique. They started blasting from both ends and the middle. They hauled a locomotive engine, tools, and materials over the mountain pass by sled and lowered them into 2 vertical shafts drilled down to the tunnel's center line. Now, instead of 2 faces of rock to attack, they had 4. 2 from the ends, 2 from the middle. It was an astonishing engineering feat that was only possible because of the Chinese men who risked death daily being lowered into the vertical shafts and small baskets to set the charges. The final breakthrough of the Summit Tunnel in late 1867 was not a celebration, but a muffled, dust-choked sigh of relief. The men had survived. The track finally crested the summit, and the Central Pacific poured out onto the gentle, flat plains of Nevada, a land so different from the granite prison they had just escaped. The race was on. Ah Sing watched the transition. On the plains, the work was less about blasting and more about pure speed. The Chinese track-laying gangs were legendary. They operated in perfect synchronized waves. Graders leveled the roadbed. Tie layers placed the massive wooden sleepers. Rail carriers ran the iron rails forward, and the spikers hammered the final permanent bond. When the two companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, came within a few miles of each other in Utah, the competition turned to outright chaos, staged for the history books. The ultimate challenge came in April 1869. The Central Pacific claimed they could lay 10 miles of track in a single day, a feat thought impossible. Ah Sing, standing beside Strobridge, watched his countrymen perform a mechanical ballet of human power. The rail carriers ran with two 560-pound rails balanced on their shoulders, dropping them in place with metronomic precision. The Chinese spikers worked in perfect tandem, 4 swings of the hammer, left, right, to set a spike, 3,520 spikes per mile. They were a human machine fueled by boiled tea and rice, performing at a speed that would forever change the metric of industrial labor. By 7 p.m. on April 28, 1869, the foreman recorded a miraculous 10 miles and 56 feet of track laid. It was a triumph of the will, and it was performed almost entirely by the Chinese crews. Part 4. The Golden Spike and the Shadow of Erasure. The culmination came on May 10, 1869, at Promontory Summit, Utah. The two rail lines, one from the west and one from the east, met. Ah Sing was there. He stood on the outer perimeter of the crowd, the dust of the Nevada desert thick on his threadbare clothes. The air was electric. Dignitaries, military officers, and railroad executives, dressed in their finest coats and stovepipe hats, mingled in the center. The locomotives of the Union Pacific, number 119, and the Central Pacific, Jupiter, nosed up to each other, nearly touching, a symbolic kiss that bound the continent. Leland Stanford stepped forward, holding a silver maul, ready to strike the ceremonial golden spike. The moment arrived, and the telegraph operator tapped out the single word that echoed across the nation, D-O-N-E. The crowd erupted. Champagne corks popped. The photographers, Andrew J. Russell and Alfred A. Hart, leapt to capture the triumphant moment for history. The famous iconic photograph was taken. The white executives stood front and center, hands clasped, engineers shaking hands. The Irish workers who had worked the flat plains for the Union Pacific stood nearby. But in the entire sweeping frame of the champagne photo, the men who had blasted the granite, risked their lives with nitroglycerin, and laid the decisive 10 miles of track, the 12,000 to 15,000 Chinese laborers were not visible. They had been deliberately excluded from the frame, pushed to the periphery, or told to remain in their distant camps. The history books, much like the photograph, would simply crop them out. Ah Sing watched the celebration, a bitter taste rising in his throat. They had sought Gam San, Gold Mountain, and they had built the Iron Dragon's spine. They had traded their lives for the promise of a better future, enduring prejudice and danger, only to be told at the moment of ultimate victory that they did not belong in the picture. The Central Pacific's own president, Leland Stanford, would later refer to them in a government report as the quiet, orderly, parsimonious, and industrious class. High praise that only further cemented their otherness. The railroad was finished. The men were paid off. The line was complete, and the great wave of Chinese immigration that had built the nation's new circulatory system was now deemed a threat. The debt was not honored. It was forgotten.
Within a few short years, the anti-Chinese sentiment, stoked by economic fear, would boil over. They had built the Golden Road, but it led only to a dead end in American society. Ah Sing finally sailed home to the Pearl River Delta, not rich, but successful enough to save his family. He left behind a grave which held the meager possessions of his younger brother, lost to an avalanche in the Sierra. And he also left behind the thousands of unrecovered bones of his countrymen, which still lie beneath the ties, the spikes, and the granite dust of the Transcontinental Railroad, a perpetual silent monument to a nation's forgotten debt. The track was laid, the continent was bound, but the truth of how it was done would take a century to unearth.